Say that again, the Queen said, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole realized silence could feel heavier than gravity. The royal court of the Sarah did not breathe the way human spaces did. It paused, as if the air itself was waiting for permission, and Ethan stood in the center of it, still holding the faint warmth of the princess's hand in his palm, wondering how a maintenance request had turned into a political event with consequences he could not even begin to measure. 10 minutes earlier, he had been recalibrating a faulty energy conduit behind a wall panel that refused to stay open, muttering to himself about design choices that clearly hated technicians. And now he was here, under lights that adjusted their brightness like they were judging him, surrounded by beings who looked almost human until you noticed the long, elegant ears that tracked every sound with unsettling precision. Queen Serapha sat above them all, composed in a way that suggested composure was not an effort, but a default state. Her posture exact, her gaze steady, her presence shaping the room more effectively than any architecture. And when she had spoken, "My daughter will marry a human," the reaction had not been loud. It had been worse, a ripple of controlled disbelief. Advisors going still, guards shifting weight by fractions of an inch, the kind of quiet that carried opinions without needing words. Ethan had not planned to be part of that sentence, not in any version of reality he found reasonable. But then the princess, Lyra, had crossed the distance between them with the kind of certainty people usually reserved for decisions they did not question, and she had taken his hand, not hesitantly, not curiously, but like she already knew the outcome and was simply catching up to it. He had looked down at her, then back up at the Queen, doing a quick internal inventory of every life choice that might have led here and coming up with nothing useful. When Serapha's eyes settled on him, it felt less like being chosen and more like being calculated, as if he had just become a variable in an equation he did not understand. Then him, she had said, voice calm, final, and the court had absorbed that statement the way a structure absorbs stress, quietly, but not without consequence. Ethan noticed the guards adjusting their stance, the advisors exchanging glances that tried very hard to be subtle and failed, and somewhere behind him, a device emitted a polite chime that sounded wildly out of place in what was rapidly becoming the most uncomfortable moment of his life. He cleared his throat, mostly because it seemed like something a human was supposed to do in a situation like this, and because no one else was speaking, which meant the responsibility had somehow defaulted to him. He became aware, with increasing clarity, that there was an expectation in the room, not spoken, but understood, a script he was supposed to follow, one that likely involved gratitude, acceptance, and a level of enthusiasm he did not currently possess. Ethan had always been good at recognizing systems, even the unspoken ones, and this one felt rigid, ancient, and very confident it would not be questioned, which, unfortunately, made him want to question it. He exhaled slowly, glancing once more at Lyra, who was still holding his hand with quiet certainty, then back at the Queen, whose gaze had not shifted even a fraction. "If this is about survival," he said, voice even, the kind of even that came from years of choosing words carefully when the stakes were unclear, "then you're choosing wrong." The words left his mouth and immediately changed the shape of the room. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was sharper, more focused, like something had just been introduced that required immediate reevaluation. Ethan watched, because there was nothing else to do, as Queen Serapha's ears stilled mid-adjustment, as her expression paused not in anger, not in offense, but in something far more dangerous. Interest. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to alter the balance of the space. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more precise, as if the conversation had shifted into a category that did not allow for error. "Say that again," she said. And this time, explain why. The request did not feel like a question, which meant Ethan could not answer it like one. And for a moment he considered all the ways this could go wrong, which was impressive given how few ways there were for it to go right. He shifted his weight slightly, aware of every gaze in the room measuring him against standards he had never agreed to. And then he did the only thing that had consistently worked for him across stations, systems, and situations that made no sense. He told the truth in the most inconvenient way possible. "You are assuming compatibility based on proximity," he said, voice steady enough to pass for confidence. Same room, same species category, same political need. But that is not how people work, and I am fairly certain it is not how your species works either. A faint ripple moved through the court, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, like a system registering unexpected input. Ethan noticed one of the advisors tilt their head a fraction, their long ear angling toward him as if trying to isolate a signal from noise. Queen Serapha did not move, which was somehow worse. "Continue," she said, and the single word carried more weight than most speeches Ethan had heard in his life. He nodded once, mostly to himself, and kept going before his better judgment could intervene. "If this is about survival, then you are solving the wrong problem," he said. "You are choosing a symbol, not a solution, and symbols look good until reality starts asking questions." He paused, just long enough to make it clear he was not finished, which felt like a dangerous habit to develop in a room like this. Lyra's grip on his hand had not loosened, which Ethan found both reassuring and mildly alarming. "Your daughter does not need a human," he added, more quietly now. "She needs someone who understands what she is expected to carry, and I do not." The words settled into the space between them, not rejected, not accepted, just existing in a way that forced everyone to acknowledge them. Somewhere to Ethan's left, a guard adjusted their stance, armor making a soft, almost apologetic sound. He took that as encouragement, or at least not immediate disapproval. Queen Serapha leaned back slightly, the movement subtle but decisive, as if she were rebalancing an equation in real time. Her eyes remained on him, but the quality of her gaze had shifted, less assessment, more analysis. "You speak as though you understand our expectations," she said, and there was no accusation in it. Only curiosity sharpened to a point. Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if the situation had been even slightly less serious. "I understand pressure," he replied. "It tends to look the same no matter where you go. Different language, different architecture, same result. People pretending they are fine while everything important depends on them not making a mistake." That earned him another ripple, quieter this time, but deeper, like something in the room had recognized itself in his words. Serapha's ears shifted, just slightly forward, an alien gesture Ethan did not fully understand but instinctively categorized as interest. "And yet," she said, "you presume to tell me I am choosing incorrectly." Ethan met her gaze, because looking away now would have undone everything he had just risked. "I am saying," he answered carefully, "that if you are choosing me because I am human, then you are not choosing me at all. You are choosing an idea, and ideas do not hold up very well when reality starts asking for proof." The silence that followed was different again, not tense, not hostile, but focused in a way that suggested something important had just shifted. Lyra finally moved, not releasing his hand, but stepping half a pace closer, her presence aligning with his as if the distance between them had always been optional. Ethan felt that more than he saw it, and for the first time since this began, he wondered if the situation was not entirely out of his control. Queen Serapha watched that movement, and something in her expression changed, not softened, not relaxed, but recalibrated, as if a variable she had not accounted for had just made itself known. "Then explain this," she said, voice lower now, quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. "If you do not belong here, why does she?" For a moment, Ethan considered the possibility that there was no correct answer to that question, only consequences, and the room seemed to lean closer as if it understood that too. He glanced down at Lyra, not because he had a strategy, but because she was the only variable in this situation that did not feel like a calculation, and she was watching him with a calm certainty that made no sense given everything happening around them. "That is exactly the problem," he said finally, lifting his gaze back to Queen Serapha. "I do not know why she does." The admission did not weaken the moment the way he might have expected. If anything, it sharpened it, like uncertainty spoken out loud had more weight than confidence that was not earned. A quiet shift moved through the court, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of reaction that happened when something honest disrupted something established. Serapha's expression did not change, but her attention did, narrowing slightly, focusing not just on his words but on the space between them. "You expect me to accept uncertainty as an answer," she said, not dismissive, not approving, simply stating the shape of what he had offered. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, because that was a fair summary of his entire approach to most things. I expect you to consider it, he replied. Because whatever this is, he glanced briefly at Lyra's hand still in his, then back at the queen. It is not following your rules, and pretending it is will not make it easier to control. That earned him a sharper reaction, not from Serapha, but from the advisors lining the edges of the chamber, a few of them shifting just enough to signal discomfort, their ears angling in ways that suggested disagreement layered with curiosity. Ethan noticed, filed it away, and continued before anyone could interrupt. You made a decision based on what should work, he said. But she is not reacting to what should work. She is reacting to something else. And if you ignore that, then whatever you are trying to protect might be the first thing you lose. The words settled heavily. Not dramatic, not loud, but anchored in a kind of logic that was difficult to dismiss without addressing. Lyra moved again, this time not just closer, but aligning herself fully beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his, her posture mirroring his in a way that felt less like imitation and more like agreement. Ethan felt that alignment more than he saw it, and it made something in his chest tighten, not fear, not quite, something closer to responsibility, which he had not signed up for and was apparently receiving anyway. Queen Serapha watched the movement closely, and for the first time, something in her composure shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a fractional adjustment that suggested recalculation rather than control. Her ears angled forward again, more pronounced this time, the gesture no longer subtle enough to ignore. You are suggesting, she said slowly, that my daughter's judgment is independent of my own. The pause before the final words carried more meaning than the words themselves. Ethan chose his next response carefully, not because he feared the answer, but because he understood the weight of what he was confirming. I am suggesting, he said, voice steady, that whatever she sees, it was not given to her, and that makes it more important, not less. Silence followed, but it was no longer the same kind of silence that had filled the room before. It was not expectation, not pressure. It was attention, focused and deliberate, like the entire court had shifted from observing an event to witnessing a decision. Serapha did not look away from him, but her focus expanded, taking in Lyra, then returning to Ethan with a clarity that felt different, less like evaluation, more like interest that had not yet decided what it meant. And if you are wrong, she said quietly, then you have just challenged the foundation of my authority for no reason. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without hesitation. Then I will fix the conduit I was assigned to repair, he said, the dry edge returning just enough to remind the room that he was still human. And I will stay very far away from your political decisions. For a fraction of a second, something almost unrecognizable passed through Serapha's expression, not amusement exactly, but close enough to register. Then it was gone, replaced by something sharper, more decisive. She rose from her seat, and the room adjusted with her, attention snapping into alignment as if gravity itself had just shifted. When she spoke again, her voice carried across the chamber with effortless authority, but the target of it had changed. Clear the chamber, she said, not loudly, but with a certainty that allowed no delay. I would like to understand this anomaly without an audience. And for the first time since this began, Ethan realized that he was no longer being evaluated in public, he was being invited into something far more dangerous. A conversation that would decide whether he remained a mistake or became something the queen herself would have to account for. The chamber did not empty immediately, which told Ethan more about the weight of the queen's words than any reaction could have, because hesitation at that level meant this was not routine. It was deviation, and deviation in a system this controlled always carried consequences. One by one, the advisors stepped back, their movements precise, their expressions carefully neutral, but their ears betrayed them, angling subtly toward Ethan as if unwilling to fully disengage, while the guards repositioned with quiet efficiency, not leaving, but creating distance that felt less like absence and more like containment. The doors did not close so much as seal, the sound soft, final, like a decision being recorded somewhere beyond the room. Ethan became aware of the space expanding around him, not physically, but in significance, The way a conversation shifts when it is no longer performative. Lyra did not release his hand, which by now felt less like a gesture and more like a statement. She had no intention of revising. Queen Serapha descended from her elevated position without urgency, each step measured, the architecture beneath her responding in subtle adjustments, as if even the floor understood who it served. When she reached them, the difference in perspective was immediate, less distance, more presence, and Ethan found himself recalibrating without meaning to, up close. The control in her expression was more apparent, not rigid, but deliberate, like someone who had practiced restraint long enough for it to become instinct. Her gaze moved between him and her daughter, not searching, not questioning, but aligning pieces of something that had not existed a few minutes ago. Release him, she said quietly, not looking at Lyra when she spoke, which made it clear the instruction was not a request. Lyra did not move. The pause that followed was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried more tension than anything that had happened in the public court. Ethan felt it immediately, the shift from political to personal, from system to relationship, and he resisted the urge to step back, not because he was certain, but because retreating now would have been interpreted as something he was not prepared to define. She is not holding me, Ethan said, before he could fully evaluate whether that was helpful or not. I have not asked her to let go. Serapha's eyes flicked to him, not sharply, but with a precision that suggested she was cataloging not just his words, but his timing, his choice to speak into a moment that did not belong to him. Lyra's grip adjusted slightly, not tighter, not looser, just enough to acknowledge the statement. The Queen's ears shifted again, a small forward angle that Ethan was beginning to associate with interest layered over caution. You speak as though you have agency here, Serapha said, and the observation was neutral, but not without implication. Ethan considered that, then gave a small, almost apologetic nod. I am trying to, he replied. It seems more useful than pretending I do not. That earned him the faintest change in her posture, not quite approval, but not dismissal either. Serapha turned her attention fully to Lyra then, her expression unchanged, but her presence more focused, like a lens narrowing. Explain, she said, a single word directed at her daughter with the same authority she had used on the entire court. Lyra met her gaze without hesitation, which Ethan found more unsettling than anything else so far, because there was no tension in it, no resistance, just clarity. He is not wrong, Lyra said, her voice calm, steady in a way that mirrored her mother's, but without the weight of command. You are choosing a symbol. Ethan felt that land before. He processed the words, because hearing his argument reflected back in her voice gave it a different kind of legitimacy, one he had not expected. Serapha did not respond immediately, which, given everything Ethan had seen, was itself a response. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, but deliberately, like space being created for something that had not yet formed. And what do you see? The Queen asked finally, her tone unchanged, but the question different now, less about control, more about understanding. Lyra's answer came without delay. Someone who does not try to become what you expect, she said. And that makes him the only one who might survive being here. Ethan blinked once, because that was not how he would have described himself, but it was not entirely inaccurate either. Serapha's gaze returned to him, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal, only a focused, almost analytical curiosity that felt far more dangerous than skepticism. Then we will test that, she said, and the statement did not sound like a threat, but it did not sound like reassurance either. Somewhere in the walls, a system adjusted, the faint hum shifting pitch, as if the palace itself had registered the change. Ethan exhaled slowly, aware that whatever came next would not be something he could fix with a tool or a calibration. And for the first time since this began, he wondered if being honest had not just complicated the situation, but redefined it entirely. The word test settled into the space between them with a weight that did not need explanation, and Ethan felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as a shift in expectations, the kind that rewrote the rules without announcing it. He glanced briefly at the surrounding architecture, at the walls that seemed too smooth to be static, at the faint patterns of light moving beneath the surface like something thinking in slow motion. And he had the distinct impression that whatever this test was, it would not involve anything as simple as a question. Queen Serapha turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the room itself, and that small movement triggered a response, a low harmonic hum passing through the floor. Subtle but undeniable, like the palace acknowledging her intent. "Follow," she said, and the command was quiet, but it carried the same authority as before, only now it was directed at him alone. Ethan hesitated for less than a second, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that once he moved, he was no longer an observer in any sense of the word. Lyra's hand shifted again, her fingers loosening just enough to allow movement, but not releasing entirely, as if she were adjusting to a path she had already accepted. Ethan stepped forward, and the space responded, panels along the wall separating with a precision that suggested they had been waiting for this exact moment, revealing a corridor that had not been visible before, its interior lined with soft light that did not illuminate so much as guide. He glanced back once, a reflex more than a decision, noticing that the guards had not followed, that the distance between the public court and this new space was not measured in feet, but in access. "You are not bringing anyone else," he said, the observation slipping out before he could filter it. Serapha did not slow. "If I require an audience," she replied, "I will create one," which Ethan decided was both an answer and a warning. The corridor felt different from the main chamber, quieter, but not empty. The kind of quiet that suggested active systems operating just beyond perception. Ethan noticed the way the air felt more stable here, less reactive, as if this part of the palace had been designed for precision rather than display. "What exactly are we testing?" he asked, not because he expected a clear answer, but because asking felt better than not knowing. Serapha stopped, and the sudden stillness made Ethan aware of how much he had been relying on motion to avoid thinking too far ahead. She turned to face him fully, and for a moment, there was no distance, no court, no observers, just the two of them and the weight of a decision that had not yet been defined. Lyra stood slightly behind him now, close enough to be present, far enough to allow the exchange to belong to them. "You," Serapha said simply, and the lack of elaboration made the statement more complete, not less. Ethan let out a small breath, nodding once as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. "That seems inefficient," he said, the dry edge returning. "There are easier ways to evaluate someone." Serapha's gaze did not shift, but there was a faint change in the angle of her ears, a subtle acknowledgement of the tone rather than the content. "Efficiency," she said, "is useful when outcomes are predictable." She stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a deliberate narrowing of space that forced attention. "You are not." Ethan considered that, then gave a slight shrug, because denying it would have been both inaccurate and unnecessary. "That is fair," he admitted. "I have been told that before, usually right before something complicated happens." A faint flicker passed through Serapha's expression, not amusement, but recognition of a pattern she was beginning to map. She lifted a hand slightly, and the wall beside them shifted, not opening fully, but revealing a surface embedded with layered data, symbols and structures that did not translate immediately, but felt structured, intentional. "This system," she said, "was designed to respond only to those it recognizes as compatible." Ethan stepped closer, not touching, just observing, the way he would with any unfamiliar piece of technology, his focus narrowing instinctively. "Compatible how?" he asked, because that mattered more than the system itself. Serapha's answer was precise. "Not by rank, not by species, not by permission," she said, her eyes remaining on him. "By alignment." The word hung there, undefined but heavy with implication. Ethan studied the surface, the faint pulsing of light beneath it, the way it seemed to react not to proximity, but to presence, and for a brief moment, something about it felt familiar in a way he could not immediately place. He frowned slightly, more to himself than to her, and then, without fully deciding to, he reached out, his hand, stopping just short of contact. "If this rejects me," he said, glancing at Serapha, "I assume that proves your point." Serapha did not answer right away, and when she did, her voice was quieter than before. "If it responds," she said, "it proves yours." Ethan exhaled slowly, aware that this was no longer theoretical, that whatever happened next would not be something he could talk his way around. And for the first time since stepping into the court, he felt something that was not just uncertainty, but anticipation, the kind that came right before something decided whether you belonged somewhere or not. For a fraction of a second, Ethan considered not touching it at all, because uncertainty could still be managed, but confirmation had a way of rewriting everything. The surface in front of him pulsed faintly, not brighter, not dimmer, just steady, like it was aware of him in a way that did not require contact. He tilted his head slightly, studying the pattern, and something about the rhythm felt less like a machine and more like a response waiting for a question it had not been asked yet. "You designed this to wait," he said quietly, more to himself than to the queen. "Not just react." Serapha did not answer, but her attention sharpened, the slight forward angle of her ears enough to confirm that the observation had not gone unnoticed. Ethan let out a small breath and closed the last inch of distance, his fingertips brushing the surface with the kind of caution usually reserved for systems that had opinions. For a moment, nothing happened, and the silence that followed felt almost deliberate, like the system was considering him rather than processing him. Then the light shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the steady pulse adjusting, aligning into a pattern that was no longer neutral. Ethan frowned slightly, not pulling his hand away, because the reaction was not rejection, it was engagement. "That is not a denial," he said, glancing at Serapha, who had not moved at all, her gaze fixed not on the panel, but on him. "It is not supposed to hesitate," she replied. And there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not doubt, not concern, but a precise awareness that something had diverged from expectation. The surface beneath Ethan's hand warmed slightly, not enough to be uncomfortable, just enough to be noticeable, and the light beneath it began to shift again, forming structures that did not immediately translate but felt intentional, layered, as if multiple systems were trying to resolve a single input. Ethan leaned in a fraction, his focus narrowing instinctively, the way it always did when he encountered something that did not behave the way it was supposed to. "It is not rejecting me because I am incompatible," he said slowly, thinking through it in real time. "It is not accepting me either." He paused, watching the pattern adjust. Again, more complex now, less binary. "It is trying to classify me." The words settled into the space, and this time, Serapha did react, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough, a slight shift in posture, a recalibration of presence that Ethan had come to recognize as significant. "That is not possible," she said, but the statement lacked the certainty of her earlier conclusions. Ethan almost smiled, not because the situation was amusing, but because he had heard that exact phrase before in environments that later turned out to be very wrong. "It is happening," he replied simply, keeping his hand where it was, resisting the urge to adjust, because the system seemed to be responding to consistency rather than input. Behind him, Lyra moved closer again, not touching him this time, but near enough that he could feel her presence aligning with his, and the moment she did, the panel reacted again, the light deepening, the pattern stabilizing into something that looked less like analysis and more like recognition. Ethan blinked once, because that was new, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm what he was already suspecting. "It is not just me," he said, his voice quieter now, more certain. "It is both of us." Serapha's gaze shifted then, not away from him, but expanding to include Lyra fully, and for the first time since this began, there was no question in her expression, only a focused, almost surgical attention to what was unfolding. The system responded again, the surface beneath Ethan's hand cooling slightly as the light resolved into a single, stable pattern that held for longer than any of the previous fluctuations. Ethan exhaled slowly, because stability meant conclusion, and conclusions in systems like this were rarely ambiguous. "That does not look like rejection," he said, not moving, not breaking contact, because whatever this was, interrupting it now felt like the wrong decision. Serapha stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing to something that felt less like authority and more like proximity. And when she spoke, her voice was lower, more controlled, but carrying a weight that had shifted from certainty to something far more complex. "No," she said, her eyes fixed on the pattern, then on him. "It does not." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with implication, and Ethan realized, with a clarity that settled in his chest like a slow, steady weight, that whatever this system had just confirmed, it was not something the Queen had planned for, and that made it far more important than anything she had. The pattern did not fade, which was the first thing Ethan noticed, because systems like this usually completed their response and returned to neutral, but this one held, steady and deliberate, as if it had reached a conclusion it was not willing to revise. He kept his hand in place, not out of confidence, but because removing it now felt like interrupting something that was still unfolding. "What does it mean?" he asked, not looking away from the surface, because the answer, whatever it was, would not be found in speculation. Queen Serapha did not respond immediately, and that hesitation carried more weight than any explanation she could have given. When she did speak, her voice was quieter, more controlled, but missing the certainty that had defined it before. "It means the system has identified alignment," she said, and the choice of words was precise, deliberate, as if she were selecting them carefully to avoid stating something she had not yet accepted. Ethan considered that, his focus shifting from the pattern to the implication behind it. Alignment between what? He asked, because the system's behavior suggested something more specific than compatibility. Serapha's gaze flicked briefly to Lyra, then back to him, and for a fraction of a second, something unguarded passed through her expression, not fear, not doubt, but recognition of a possibility she had not accounted for. "Between you and her," she said finally, and the statement settled into the space with a clarity that did not require elaboration. Ethan let out a slow breath, because that was not the direction he had expected this to go, and he had already adjusted his expectations more times than he was comfortable with. "That seems unlikely," he said, not dismissively, but honestly, because from his perspective, nothing about this situation followed a pattern that made sense. Behind him, Lyra stepped closer again, her presence no longer tentative, no longer reactive, but steady, as if the system's confirmation had aligned something in her as well. "It is not unlikely," she said, her voice calm, carrying the same quiet certainty that had defined her actions from the beginning. "It is consistent." Ethan turned his head slightly, enough to see her without breaking the connection entirely, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not curiosity, not interest, but recognition, as if she had just been given a language for something she had already understood. "Consistent with what?" he asked, because that mattered more than the system itself. Lyra did not hesitate. "With what I sensed when I saw you," she said, and the simplicity of the answer made it more difficult to dismiss. Ethan almost smiled, not because the explanation was reassuring, but because it was so completely outside the framework he was used to that arguing with it felt inefficient. "That is not a measurable metric," he said, the dry tone returning just enough to ground him. "It is here," she replied, nodding slightly toward the panel. "Which means it is measurable enough." Ethan exhaled slowly, acknowledging the point even if he did not fully understand it. Queen Serapha stepped closer, her attention now fully anchored on the pattern, her posture shifting again, not to assert control, but to evaluate a new variable that had just proven itself relevant. "This system does not create connections," she said, more to herself than to them. "It reveals them." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than he expected. He glanced back at the surface, at the stable pattern that refused to dissolve, and for the first time since this began, he considered the possibility that this was not a mistake, not a malfunction, but an answer to a question he had not known was being asked. "If that is true," he said slowly, choosing his words with more care now, "then whatever this is, it did not start here." Serapha's gaze shifted to him again, sharper this time, more focused, because that statement introduced a timeline she had not yet examined. "Explain," she said, and the word carried less command now, more demand for understanding. Ethan hesitated, not because he did not have a response, but because the response felt incomplete even as he formed it. "I cannot," he admitted, and the honesty did not weaken the moment. It clarified it. "But I know how systems behave when they recognize something, instead of analyzing it. And this is not analysis." He nodded slightly toward the panel. "This is confirmation." The silence that followed was different again, not tense, not uncertain, but dense with realization, and for the first time since the Queen had chosen him, Ethan understood that the situation had moved beyond selection, beyond politics, into something neither of them fully controlled. Serapha's ears shifted once more, a subtle forward angle that Ethan now recognized as focused attention, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a new kind of weight, not authority imposed, but authority adapting. "Then we are no longer deciding whether you belong here," she said, her gaze steady on him. "We are deciding what it means that you already do." The statement did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like the beginning of a problem neither of them had prepared to solve, and Ethan became aware of it in the way the room seemed to hold its structure a little tighter, as if the palace itself had decided to pay closer attention. He finally pulled his hand away from the surface, not abruptly, but with the care of someone stepping back from something that had already made its point. And the pattern remained, unchanged, stable in a way that suggested his presence had not been required to maintain it. "That is new," he said quietly, more to himself than to the Queen, because systems did not usually sustain outcomes without input. Serapha noticed it immediately, her gaze shifting from his hand to the panel, then back to him, recalculating again, but this time with less resistance, more precision. "It should have reset," she said, not as a correction, but as an observation that no longer carried certainty. Ethan gave a small nod, because that aligned with what he expected, and the fact that it did not happen mattered more than the initial response. "Then it is not responding to me," he said. "It is holding something it has already decided." The distinction seemed to settle into the space between them, not fully understood, but not ignored. Lyra stepped closer to the panel now, her attention fixed on the pattern with the same quiet focus she had shown from the beginning. And when she lifted her hand, she did not hesitate, her fingertips brushing the surface with a familiarity that felt unearned and completely natural at the same time. The system reacted, but not by changing, by deepening. The light intensifying slightly, the pattern sharpening as if her presence reinforced what had already been established. Ethan exhaled slowly, because that confirmed something he had only suspected a moment ago. "It is not just alignment," he said, watching the interaction carefully. "It is reinforcement." Serapha's ears angled forward again, more noticeably this time, and when she spoke, her voice carried less distance, more engagement. "Explain," she said, and the word no longer felt like a command, but a request for clarity. Ethan nodded once, shifting his weight slightly as he organized the thought in a way that would not make it sound like guesswork. "Most systems like this resolve input into a state and then reset to baseline," he said, gesturing lightly toward the panel without touching it again. "This one did not, which means the state it reached is not temporary. It is considered valid beyond the initial interaction." He paused, glancing briefly at Lyra's hand, still resting against the surface, then back to the Queen. "And when she interacts with it, it does not reevaluate, it strengthens, which suggests the system is not deciding between us. It has already grouped us." The words hung there, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but carrying a weight that neither of them could dismiss. Serapha did not respond immediately, and the silence that followed was not hesitation. It was processing, the kind that required recalibration at a level she was not used to. "Adjusting, grouped," she repeated, the word precise, controlled, but no longer anchored in dismissal. Ethan gave a slight nod, because that was the simplest way to describe something that did not yet have a better term. "Whether that is temporary or permanent, I do not know," he added. "But it is not random." Lyra lowered her hand slowly, and the pattern held, unchanged, stable, as if confirming the statement without needing to elaborate. She turned slightly toward her mother, her expression calm, but carrying a clarity that had only grown stronger since the system responded. "You asked what it means," she said, her voice steady. "It means this is not a decision you can undo by choosing differently." The words were simple, but the implication behind them shifted the entire structure of the situation, moving it from selection to consequence. Ethan felt that shift settle in his chest, not as pressure, but as a realization that whatever came next would not be about whether he stayed or left, but about what staying already implied. Serapha's gaze moved between them again, But this time, there was no attempt to separate variables, no effort to isolate cause from effect, only a focused attention on the result that now existed whether she approved of it or not. "Then we adjust," she said finally, and the statement carried a new kind of authority, not one that imposed control, but one that adapted to reality as it revealed itself. She turned slightly, the corridor responding to her movement with a subtle shift in light, and when she looked back at Ethan, her expression had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but entirely significant. Less evaluation, more consideration. "If the system recognizes you as part of her outcome," she said, her voice calm, precise, "then the question is no longer whether you are suitable." Her gaze held his, steady and deliberate. "It is whether you understand what that outcome requires." Ethan let out a slow breath, because that was not a question he could answer with observation alone, and for the first time since this began, he realized that whatever came next would not just test whether he belonged here. It would test whether he was willing to find out why. For a moment, no one moved, not because they could not, but because movement implied a decision, and Ethan was beginning to understand that this place measured decisions more carefully than actions. He shifted his gaze from the panel to Queen Serapha, then to Lyra, and back again, mapping the situation in the only way he knew how, not through authority or expectation, but through consequence. "Understanding usually comes after the requirement," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter now, less defiant, more deliberate. Not before. Serapha studied him without interruption, her expression composed but no longer distant, as if she had accepted that whatever this was, it would not resolve through control alone. "That is inefficient," she replied, though the statement lacked its earlier certainty, more observation than judgment. Ethan gave a slight nod, because that was accurate, and accuracy felt like the only stable ground left. "Most useful things are," he said, "especially the ones people do not plan for." The words settled into the space between them, and for a brief moment, the silence felt almost balanced, not empty, not tense, just present. Lyra stepped forward again, closing the last bit of distance between them, her movement unhurried, intentional, and when she spoke, it was not to challenge, not to explain, but to define. "Then you will learn," she said, her voice calm, certain in a way that did not require agreement, "because you are already part of it." Ethan let out a small breath, something between a laugh and an acknowledgement, because there was no argument he could make against that without ignoring everything that had just happened. He glanced back at the panel one more time, the stable pattern still holding, unchanged, and for the first time, he did not see it as a test or a system, but as a statement he had not been asked to make. "That is a very confident assumption," he said, though there was no resistance in it, only recognition that the situation had moved beyond his ability to opt out. Serapha's attention shifted between them again, but now there was no attempt to separate, no effort to redefine, only a measured acceptance that the variables had already aligned. She stepped closer, not to assert control, but to stand within the same space they occupied, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. "It is not an assumption," she said, her voice precise, steady, carrying the weight of someone who had made decisions for an entire system and was now adjusting one in real time. "It is an outcome." Ethan held her gaze, not challenging, not submitting, simply present in a way that matched the gravity of the moment. "Then outcomes have requirements," he said, because that was the part he understood, the part that could still be approached logically. Serapha inclined her head slightly, a minimal movement that acknowledged the statement without reducing it. "They do," she said, "and you will meet them." Ethan almost asked how, almost questioned what that meant in practical terms, but something in her tone made it clear that the answer would not be given, it would be revealed. Lyra's hand finally released his, not abruptly, not reluctantly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to hold on to maintain connection, and the absence of that contact felt different than he expected, not like distance, but like stability that no longer required reinforcement. The corridor around them shifted again, the light adjusting subtly, as if marking a transition that did not need announcement. Ethan exhaled slowly, because there was no version of this where. He returned to fixing conduits and pretending this had not happened, and for the first time, He was not entirely sure he wanted to. Serapha turned slightly, the path ahead opening without visible command. And when she looked back at him, there was no question in her expression now, only direction. "Come," she said, and the word did not feel like an order. It felt like inclusion. Ethan hesitated for less than a second, not out of doubt, but because he understood that this step would define everything that followed. And then he moved, not because he had decided, but because the situation had already decided for him. And as he followed the queen deeper into a system that had just recognized him as part of its outcome, one thought settled in with quiet clarity. He had not been chosen, not in the way he understood it. He had been identified, and whatever that meant, it was only beginning to reveal itself.